digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're going to continue the session with Jeff from Starlight Runner, Oliver from QWERTY Films, Charlie from the Generation of Z, and Sanj from Halcyon. We'll continue with Sanj talking about technology for augmented reality.
And one thing I would reiterate, Tanya, as well, is that even though there's kind of been some bad avenues that have been explored, the need for this technology, or should I say, the hunger for this technology from the consumer, is very high. I learned this with holographic. When we started taking the holographic systems to market, people wanted them. People were like, "Wow, we can do this. We can bring dead people back. We can communicate with people in new ways." And the cool thing about this technology is that it's starting to reignite a fire that's been around for a long time, and that fire is just getting bigger and bigger, and people are really into it, especially people like gamers and people that are really into comms. However, it's something that just needs to. I think the approach needs to change on the development of these fantastic products.
And when you say the approach needs to change, in what way do you think that approach needs to change specifically?
It's the industry that I work in, initially is very it's very male dominated. It's very metric. It's very tech focused. There is there are, don't get me wrong, there are some creative people out there, but it's very small, and the gender divide is dramatically male, and personally I think that's a really big problem. The kind of approach needs to be a lot more universal, and there needs to be more people involved in this new debate, this new evolution in human behaviour.
You've opened up the door there. You've opened up the door, so I am going to follow you through that door, and I'm going to make a statement that I feel free to disagree with me on this, guys, but I am outnumbered 4-1 right now. So I'm going to say this, which is that what we're talking about here is a transmedia industry and an immersive entertainment industry that fundamentally, when we look at the individual silos of those industries, we're talking about gaming, which is primarily male orientated traditionally. We're looking at filmmaking, which again is primarily male orientated. We're looking at the media industries, which again primarily driven by males. So when you look at it in that context, is there any reality that you can perceive here where there will be an equal balance of women within that industry? And I don't mean to say that in a way that's in any way demeaning to women, but I do think that there is a certain reality right now, which is, even if we're talking about an immersive, an emerging, industry here and an emerging landscape, I still think that fundamentally it's male dominated, and there isn't a huge amount that I can see that's going to necessarily change that right here, right now, because ultimately when we're talking about an emerging industry, that requires investment, and that investment usually comes from people who are looking at the traditional industries and saying, you know what, I trust this person, I trust this company, I trust these people because they've done this thing before, and this is their space, and ultimately that is going to be men. Care to disagree with me, chaps?
Tanya, this is Gomez, I'm coming after you. Tanya, honestly, the great strides in transmedia, and this is completely from my perspective, have happened because women have recognized the power of multi-platform narrative. Our greatest champions have been women. Are some of the greatest practitioners of transmedia storytelling have been female. There's something, I think, about the perception of non-linear narrative that seems to come a little bit easier to the female mind, and the investments that have been made into my company. The staff members at Starlight Runner have been largely a female, and the champions in Hollywood, Amy Pascal, a huge champion of multi-platform storytelling, and the first woman in all of Hollywood to grant an overall transmedia deal with a company, which happened to be mine. That established a precedent. People at the Producers Guild of America who recognized the potential of transmedia were women. Gail Ann Hurd, a great producer, the producer of The Walking Dead, recognized the potential of transmedia and promoted the practice and myself within the Producers Guild of America, which yielded the Transmedia Producer Credit, and so forth. So it's really my hope that that women become more expressive as storytellers and kind of fight for that, and that they're recognized for their prominent role in proliferating multi-platform narrative.
I'm glad you said that, Jeff. Actually, Susan Bond was due to be on this call with us, but unfortunately she couldn't connect due to the wonders of Skype and technology. But she will be joining a future session. And of course, there are names like Jane McGonigal and the various other people who you're quite right. There is definitely within the kind of transmedia space versus the individual silos of those industries. I think there is definitely more of a trend for women in that space. And with things like Power to the Pixel, Liz Rosenthal, driving that movement towards transmedia development and the finance market behind it. I definitely think there is a strong proponent of female representation in the transmedia market for sure.
Alison Norrington, Caitlin Burns, Christy Dina, Lena Srivitslana, all over the world. Female practitioners of transmedia have been proliferating.
Indeed, absolutely. Glad that we managed to clear that one up then. Right, so going back to the subject at hand, I wanted to ask you, Charlie, a quick question, which is that I found it really interesting when I did come. So, for the record, I went to Generation Z last night. I was splattered in blood and what have you, and I went through the experience. But the question I have is this, and in my observation, with immersive theatre, there is very much the passive audience, which is what I experienced last night with Generation Z, where we are guided through the narration of your actors and your narrators to experience a story, an immersive story, yes, but still to participate as more of an audience and to have kind of a backseat view of what's going on, versus the experience of somebody like The Heist, which is very much putting you in the forefront. So there is actual interaction happening with those key actors that drives multiple different outcomes. So not necessarily your scripted outcomes, but a multitude of sub outcomes that can occur. So it feels much more integrated as an immersive, engaging, interactive experience. So I'm curious in terms of that degree of interaction, where we think the difference between experiential versus immersive theatre actually lies. At what point do you think that line is drawn in the sand, Charlie?
Yeah, great. So to me, immersive is not the same as interactive. They're two different things. We made a very, very conscious decision to have a linear story that is delivered from beginning to end, much like an action film. So what we've actually created, when you read the whole script, is like Fast and the Furious 7. That's the lens. People want to hoop and holler. Things like Punch Drunk, Secret Cinema, great, absolutely, but completely different, because when I walk out of those experiences, or Shunt, I can't help but feel, what was that about, and what did I truly have to connect with? Apart from a very, very important thing to connect with, which is my own experience where I made my story up, or I discovered the story. We wanted to move away from that and really provide someone with a Hollywood beginning, middle, and end. And I think Oliver touched before that they're very, very different audiences. We're very lucky because we get all these people who are fanboys who would never go to any immersive theatre. They wouldn't even go and see a musical. But then we get all the people who go to immersive theatre coming along to this. So we kind of made the show for the fans. And in order to do that, we can't just offer a free roam experience where people can kind of just do what they like. We do have to set up the structure and the rules, which is there's engagement at specific times, but you're led through and driven by the performances. And just touching back to the Last of Us, which is really key here. The reason I believe, yes, good story, yes, amazing design, that those boys took 5 years before, going through their universe, but most importantly is they were amazing performers who were delivering that through motion capture. And I guess that's what we will always try and do. People put us in a box. Our New York investors and presenters over there, it's a scare attraction with a narrative. That's the new idea. But for us, it's not. We're not a scare attraction. And I say that to everyone at the beginning of the show, because, please don't talk over the scenes, because we've gone out of our way to make the story and we want you to engage with it. But we've had to make a conscious choice to follow the tropes in that narrative for the existing core audience who expect a certain thing, as well as provide moments of interaction and moments where the audience can add to the story or make a choice or, get the power on or stitch up that wound from the character who got, exploded and he's got shrapnel in his belly. So yeah, I think we're by no means, I would call us an interactive show. I think that's more what Punch Drunk would do, where you're literally interacting all the time. But for us, I do call it immersive because we're pulling you inside a world and we're putting you inside the movie. You're not sitting down; the movie's happening all around you. And that's that was our lens, I guess, of creation of the work.
Absolutely. Sanj, I'm curious what your view or your take on this is in terms of at what point do you consider that there is a place for technology or for, creative design of technology in an experience that is necessarily immersive?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it's actually a staple of how the team at Halition designs technology. Ultimately, it's the technology needs to be a seamless aspect of the experience. It shouldn't be, a gimmicky add-on. I mean, obviously that depends on the narrative, but what we try to deliver is an aspect of your experience where you don't think about the technology, you just think about the engagement. And ultimately that stems from, us working with brands. A lot of the brands we work with, they want to bring, the consumer closer to them. And so that's what we try to do. I guess the problems we have at the moment, within the industry that I work on, and this is just my perspective, is that a lot of it's changing now, but over the last sort of 5 years, a brand would come to us and they'll go, right, okay, everyone's talking about digital, everyone's talking about technology. We've got an innovation jet. Give us the best thing you've got. And I think that's the problem at the moment, is the way people are trying to incorporate digital into their experiences is very much like, I've got a box to tick, or I've got some cash to spend. And what we've
not
really
similar
tried
to mobile
to do
then.
Well, yeah, but when you buy an iPhone or when you buy a digital product, you don't care about what chips are in there or what how powerful the camera is or anything like that. Even though that's a kind of USP of the sale of the product, it's all about I'm using a device. Does it allow me to do what I want it to do? And that's how we kind of apply our design to the design of technology.
The reason I said not dissimilar to mobile is because I think there is this trend at the moment, certainly, of this kind of notion from corporates and brands of, we're going to do something and, we need something mobile too. We need a mobile website, we need a mobile game, we need mobile, And even if it's not necessarily the relevant thing, even if it's not necessarily the right thing, and one of the things that I find myself often saying to clients, before we begin anything, is to really ask them, is it really the right thing? Do you really need this? And I feel like that's kind of the question that should be applied in some cases with transmedia, which is to say that whether it's transmedia or it's immersive, I think there is this question still to be had, which is, looking at the actual narrative and the actual storytelling, on its own, whether or not there is a need for it to be transmedia or there is a need for there to be an element of immersion. Rather than this mad dash to include something because it is the cool new thing, or it is the kind of misunderstood element that people want to have it just because they can say they did it. And I'm curious what your experience with that has been, Jeff, in terms of people kind of coming to you and asking for a transmedia project or a cross-media storytelling project of some sort where there really isn't a need for it?
Yeah, it does happen from time to time. Now, I mean, I'm a believer that if you have a story that you want to tell to a huge number of people, that it pays to be savvy about how one might communicate the story in different ways across different media, and that's going to be a truism moving into the future. Now, if you've got a story about a few 20-somethings getting stoned in a room talking about Scooby-Doo, that's going to be difficult to create a transmedia experience around that. It's just it's tricky. So it's the real job of it is to get people to understand that if you're going to do this, you have to think about how it might be done fairly early in the development process. Okay, so there is a beauty and elegance to transmedia storytelling that the visionary, the storyteller, ought to consider, because these components of story on different media, they have the potential to comment on the movie or the television series, and do so in fascinating ways that allow you to take different perspectives or look at events in very, very different ways. And it becomes artful. It becomes something that can be truly engaging. But in order to do that, you have to start thinking about it very, very early in the process.
I know this is a theme that Oliver and I have spoken about on numerous occasions. In fact, is this need or desire to look at earlier in the development stage what the possibilities are for multi-platform development. So game development alongside film development, as a for example. And I'm curious, Oliver, what your thoughts are on this. From a transmedia perspective, if you see the potential for earlier development to allow broader storytelling opportunities.
Yeah, I definitely do. I think, as Jeff mentioned earlier, part of the issue at the core of this is that we're developing a new medium, say with these immersive experiences, that demands its own type of narrative aesthetics. That hasn't quite maybe been developed yet, but I am yet to go to Generation Z, so I will hold fire on saying that conclusively. But I think that's definitely part of it in terms of, say, games or mobile apps, TV spin-offs, published materials, all that kind of thing. I think to a certain extent that already exists in the fact that, IP has been picked up from such a variety of sources in filmmaking over the last 20 years. The rise of graphic novel adaptations, which are not just obviously superhero things, but Sin City or The Walking Dead, and yes. So I think you and I, Tanya, were talking about the Walking Dead itself, and you were saying that there was the app that went alongside it, where you were effectively betting on the death count in that episode, and then everyone was sort of saying, oh, I think there's going to be 20, I think there's going to be 35, and then people are tweeting about it and all that kind of thing. I think that's a very clever idea. I think it's difficult because there's a kind of there's the idealist in me that looks at this and thinks this is such an amazing opportunity for developing entirely new kinds of stories, and that's the reason why I'm here on this call. That's what really excites me and interests me. There's a cynical kind of business part of me that thinks, well, actually at the moment a lot of what this is about is basically just securing dollars coming in. It's about getting brand loyalty from your audience is about building a piece of IP into a transmedia brand that can be consumed and paid for in in multiple numbers of ways, even if it's perhaps free at the point of use.
But is there anything, Oliver? Sorry, is there anything though that's stopping it from being franchise first? Does it necessarily have to be IP first? Can it be franchise first? The nature of what we see happening with Marvel and with Star Wars is, these are multiple line of business franchises at their heart, and yes, they have a universal IP in terms of there isn't a universe around that IP. But fundamentally, they are a multi-line of business franchise. Is there anything that stops you from being franchise first in this context?
I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind that with the Marvel phenomenon, there is an argument that was a response to business concerns that stars were getting too expensive in the light of ever declining box office receipts. And people couldn't afford to pay movie stars gross points on participation, and so they decided that the best way around this was to develop a franchise, an IP that itself, the brand was what you sold. You sold Iron Man first and foremost, or the Avengers first and foremost. You don't sell necessarily the individual actors within it. Obviously, they bring an enormous amount to the table from a business and creative perspective still, but that was part of the driving force behind this from the studio systems, according to that argument.
But having said that, way before there were films, there was always a line of business that was comics. There was always a line of business that was toys. Way before the films ever came to fruition. So from that perspective, do we necessarily, I mean, maybe we're biased, maybe this by the nature of our conversation we are biased because we look at things as being necessarily film first or game first, but from a franchise like something like Marvel, comic is really where it started, and when we look at that as a franchise, it isn't about those films. Yes, there were certainly some commercial decisions that were made as a result of the issues around film, and I don't disagree with that at all, but having said that, as a franchise, it started life as a comic book franchise, and it started life as a retail and consumer product franchise that evolved into something that has now become a bit of a monster that we all dread, when there's a new film coming out.
At Starlight Runner, we've had to put a lot of thought into exactly what it is that you're talking about. There are only a limited number of established, elaborate story worlds in current popular culture, and those have been snapped up by the big studios. We recently saw a huge Chinese firm invest over $120 million into Valiant Entertainment. Now, the Valiant comic books are known to actually a comparatively small handful of people compared with Marvel and DC, and yet this colossal investment is being made because it is a kind of prefabricated superhero universe. So that's all gone. The call that we're hearing from precincts around the world is it possible to think franchise first? Is it possible to create an intellectual property from scratch that is designed to proliferate across multiple media platforms and be big, be capable of generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues, be popular? I feel that the answer is yes, you can do this, but that we are looking at a fairly new canvas. It's a massive canvas, and that there needs to be an artistic approach that takes that mass and those multiple platforms into account, so that the way that a filmmaker creates a Star Wars with a screenplay and some cameras and crew and so forth is the way that the transmedia storyteller approaches many screens and many kinds of venues for expressing the totality of what has to be probably a more epic narrative, a sprawling narrative. We believe it can be done, and it can be done from a business model perspective as well, because there are so many companies around the world that are interested in making these kinds of investments so that they can, um, publish more books, develop more game apps that are fortified by the momentum of a franchise in the making, and by the advertising and partnerships that can be had with a franchise in the making. So I don't want you to think that I'm speaking cynically. I don't see this as cynical. I see this as something that is new and has the potential to be actually really exciting and immersive.
And I fully agree with you. And I think a really good example of this kind of franchise first approach is things like Defiance. The TV series and the game being developed side by side with an interactive, almost kind of interactive storyline and narrative that arches over both of these products. So I do think it is entirely plausible and possible from a commercial perspective to have something that is developed from a franchise first perspective. But I am curious as to whether or not we think that within the context of these kind of developments, there is a need to still have a film first approach or a game first approach to the actual franchise itself, or to the nature of the storytelling. And Oliver, I'd be interested to hear your view on this, whether you think that it is still important to have a film first perspective on a franchise.
No, I don't. I think as you and Jeff are saying, with these very large scale and probably in the future increasingly small scale ventures, it's the world that's important. And Michael Bay is responsible for a lot of things, and one of them is showing us that you can make a mega franchise out of some small plastic toys. And it's phenomenal, and that's Transformers, I played with as a kid, but I hadn't thought about them for 20 years, and I don't think that's significant. I do think the story, I think the kinds of stories that world permits you to tell are significant, and that holds true in all sorts of ways, like like superheroes. There's generally common threads that run through them, so they in one way or another are slightly shunned from society. They're the loner, they're the individual, for example. I think also what Jeff was talking about was fascinating, partly because what we're dealing with in an increasingly and truly globalized society on a kind of linked through the web is the specified audiences worldwide. So you could take a comic book that's known to relatively few people in each territory, but if they're very brand loyal, if they're very engaged in it, and that you can hit them and get your product to them, and that they will consume it, that makes it, that provides you with some kind of business security in a way that, traditionally, say, movies in 20th century increasingly became about broader and broader audience type narratives, because you were firing into the dark in a sense. You set out your big tentpole production, and you hope that it has a narrative that people worldwide will lock into. But you're not. That's very, very different from saying, well, I know that this group of people, and there's groups of those kinds of people in territories all over the world who like this kind of thing, are people that I can appeal to, and I can direct my products to them, because okay, I have a movie coming out theatrically, and that's very expensive and difficult, but I'll also have a game, and I'll also have a web series, and we'll also have this and that and the other. So that promotional aspect that's very specified is hugely significant.
There's two things I want to say to that. And the first is that I think that in terms of what you're saying, both with the Valiant thing and also just in terms of kind of niche comics and being able to develop those for mainstream audiences, I think things like Frank Miller's 300 is a great example of somebody taking a bit of a long shot on something that actually very few people knew necessarily about Frank Miller's 300 before it became a theatrical film. But post-film, it became a trend. It became a thing that people wanted to kind of climb on the back of, and I think that's very prevalent in the nature of mainstream audiences kind of taking on the kind of sci-fi and fantasy kind of genre as they have over the last decade. A decade ago, geeks and nerdiness and sci-fi were considered as very, very niche, and now when we look at the proportion of films that are making the slates, the majority of these films now fall well within the sci-fi and geek and nerdy genres in a way that we wouldn't have seen maybe a decade ago. So that's one statement I wanted to make. But the second thing, I'm kind of curious on your take on this one. This kind of goes to both Oliver and Jeff, really, which is that I think we're fundamentally seeing a lack of originality and a lack of new storytelling to a certain extent. When we look at the approach that people are taking with a lot of this additional development. So we're seeing new projects emerging for things like The Walking Dead, having the prequel series, and we're seeing additional side series of additional expansion characters for things like Marvel's Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. We're seeing another TV series happening there. We're seeing additional extensions of things like Daredevil going on to Netflix and what have you, expanding the universe that way. But it's all very much an extension of existing IP, but there's very new original IP that's really making a name for itself in this context of transmedia space. And I wonder what your take on that is, Jeff, in terms of, do we think that transmedia only really works successfully for existing IP, or is this something that we do feel that there is scope and space for new IP to really make a mark in the transmedia space?
Well, first of all, I think we have to keep in mind that that the Marvel Cinematic Universe launched with Iron Man, which was a character that I think only vaguely existed in most people's minds, if at all. And that the proliferation of content that's emerging out of Marvel is a sign that the transmedia model works. It's a story world that's proliferating itself because it has this incredible loyalty, because the stories are being told well, not just because the characters are iconic and have been rooted in pop culture for the last 30 or 50 years. Now, can you take that and launch something entirely new? Again, it's something that we run up against in terms of a lot of resistance with. You're taking a risk, and so what we encourage our clients and our partners to do is to seed these transmedia implementations without necessarily using film or television as a driving platform. So to launch with comic books and webisodes and apps and things like that mitigates the enormous financial risk, but provides a proof of concept and begins to build momentum, especially if you've also established this kind of dialogue architecture where fans and the storyteller can kind of communicate with one another. That was evidenced in the recent Valiant relaunch, where the intellectual property was comparatively tiny, but there was a lot of noise being made around it, and an small but ardent fan base helped to light the fire that created this investment that resulted in what's to come, the Sony 5-picture deal we just saw with Valiant. So I believe that you can do this with from scratch intellectual property development You just need some good talent, perhaps that has a decent track record, and people willing to make a modest initial investment to throw the spark necessary to catch it on.
Absolutely. So guys, I want to thank you all for taking the time out and joining me on today's session. In closing, what I want to do is fire out one last question to each of you, which is to ask you what projects or what technology is coming down the line that you think is, noteworthy or significant in some way. Let's maybe start with Sanj.
There's a couple of things we're working on at the moment. One of them where we're seeing a big level of scale is in our tracking software. So tracking people's movements, tracking their gesture within a sort of experiential space. We're actually starting to design a lot of shows for some of the brands that we mentioned today, actually, for a couple of launches that are coming up soon. Where we're going to have a catwalk show which highlights the fashion of a certain brand, and as the model is moving on stage, we're going to fuse their movements with holographic technology, but instead of it being staged and rehearsed, it's literally going to react on the movements of their body. So as they walk across the stage, we'll have these elements follow them, whether it's lightning strikes or ethereal creatures that are following them, that kind of stuff. The second thing where we're seeing a lot of scale, and some of you may not like the technology, is VR. There is this huge thirst for VR at the moment, and it's particularly within the gaming industry. But a lot of the brands we work with really want to communicate to this market and design experiences that utilize the Sony Morpheus or the Valve Vive. So we're actually starting to shoot and develop that content for those platforms.
Okay. And what about you, Charlie? What do you think is the new or interesting projects coming down the line?
Yeah, definitely similar. I mean, in the augmented reality sphere, so we're working on a 3D full realistic zombie that can be triggered off a smartphone or a device or any eyewear, which is triggered, say, from an invisible smart point, like our logo or anything. But the key difference with the zombie, it's not, people have done this before where it's sort of just an animation of where it grabs at you. This zombie knows the proximity of the user. So it can geospatially map how close that user is. And basically, once you've got infected with that zombie, each time you open the app, it's with you at all times. It follows you home. It has a life of its own, which is quite weird. But we work on that, and also a bit of facial recognition stuff. We're working with another group. The product's called Firefly, which can in real time, put any sort of skin over the face, so it can zombify people in real time without it having to go through that application. It sort of does it live. So yeah, I'm really interested in that mixed reality sphere, and I'm never going to launch it unless it's elegant and integrated properly. And I think that's already been talked about, but this is sort of why we're holding off on some of the stuff in London and using it as a bit of a test, because we open in New York next summer. So we'll be testing this year on all of that stuff so that it's all at the best quality for next year.
Okay, and Oliver, what about you? What's your thoughts?
I was just thinking when Charlie was talking about that it feels a bit sort of 2001, like Siri suddenly turns into like this monstrous thing. Because I always knew that he was a dodgy character. It's difficult because I think a lot of the emerging technologies in film are incredibly tedious. There's movie theaters now where it blows a bit of wind in your face, or there's smelloscope and all this kind of stuff, and you just think. This is so somehow feels so gimmicky and outdated in the face of some of the things that the people on this call are producing. So I'm not really particularly excited about that. I am excited, I guess. One of the things that I increasingly notice when I go to the cinema is the difference that a proper sound system makes, and the development of the soundscaping that goes on. The sound engineers who work in film are phenomenal, and the work that they do. That is what draws me to the cinema more than necessarily a big screen. Having said that, I'm not too proud to say that I'll be, queuing up for Jurassic World and Star Wars, and I have to just fly the flag for Mad Max, which I'm just giddy with excitement for.
You are not revealing your geekiness at all, Ollie. At all.
Ollie, we need to talk. We're thinking we might do a Mad Max show in the Outback.
Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness!
Show,
Mad Max!
yeah.
Oh yes, please. Yes, let's talk.
We're talking. Yeah,
let's talk. Yeah, no. I think that's really, really fantastic. So, yeah. Well, now I'm just thinking about how I can persuade Charlie to let me help out with Mad Max in the Outback. So I'll
move to Australia.
Okay, now that we've hooked you two up with your new bromance, we'll move on to Jeff.
Guys, my observation has a little bit less to do with technology and more about where the new storytellers are coming from and where the new consumers of story, multi-platform story, are coming from. I'm just returned from the United Arab Emirates, where there was a Middle East film and Comic-Con that drew almost 55,000 people to the Dubai World Trade Center. These were young people who have been consuming global pop culture, everything from Japanese anime to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, many of them covertly, because while the UAE is a fairly liberal country, its neighboring countries not so much. These are 30% of the attendees were female, and they were expressing themselves with comics that they had drawn secretly in their rooms, with paintings and with costumes, some of them over their hijabs, and the exuberance, the sheer passion that they had for these story worlds was just flooring. This Comic-Con is not going to be an anomaly. The company behind it, Extra Cake, it's kind of an ad agency, is going to start proliferating these pop culture conventions across the Middle East, into Africa, even into China, because the hunger for this content is so great there. Now, are they going to come up against resistance from the governments? The answer is yes, but they're not going to be stopped. There is an erosion occurring to the resistance to this kind of pop culture consumption, and because it's video games and because it's the internet, it's not being taken quite as seriously by these countries as film and television, and that's where we're going to see these incredible advancements. So for me, these multi-platform story worlds are in so many ways the answer to connecting us all, to creating the tribes and communities that Tanya was talking about on a kind of cosmic level, and to opening up the imaginations and eventually the freedoms to express themselves that all of these young people are becoming more and more hungry for. That, to me, is the greatest development in transmedia storytelling that's arising over the course of the next few years.
It's actually really interesting that you say this, because we've just come off the back end of Star Wars Celebration over in Anaheim, and we're coming up to London Comic Con, MCM's London Comic Con, in literally a couple of weeks' time, and I find it really interesting that we actually are kind of moving away from this very San Diego based Comic-Con culture, which is that, for many years the heart and beating soul of all things pop culture and Comic-Con and kind of geekiness was at San Diego. But what we're seeing now is this emergence of massively strong markets in other areas and other territories, and you're certainly looking at the London MCM Comic-Con. These guys are very, very close now. They're only about 20,000 attendees short per event now of the numbers that we're seeing in San Diego. So when you think about that, that's 100,000 attendees per event that we're talking about easily. And we're beginning to see this notion that actually it's cool to turn up at a Comic-Con. It's no longer a geeky thing. You know, the amount of people that were watching the live stream of Star Wars Celebration, by comparison to any previous Star Wars Celebration live stream, was phenomenal. And that goes to show, I think, a lot in terms of the shift of perception around, you know, this notion that it's okay to consume this type of entertainment. It's okay to talk about this type of entertainment, and it's okay to share in this kind of entertainment. And I think that's a really interesting future for all things transmedia. But guys, I want to thank you all very much for your time. We've managed to go hugely over time. Before we all disappear, I will just ask you very, very briefly to just shout out for me your Twitter handle or your URL, or however you would like the audience to be able to follow you. If we start out with Oliver.
It's at Oliver Kassman, Kassman. I also just want to shout out for Crimson Peak, but that's it.
And Sanj?
Yeah, it's just at Sanj Surati, so SanjSurati, and also a big shout out to Halishin, which is the company I work for.
Wonderful. And Charlie?
You can find me through www.thegenerationofz.com or www.gamechangeproductions.co.nz.
Okay, and Jeff?
You can reach me through Twitter at Jeff_Gomez. Remember the underscore, the other Jeff Gomez. He gets really pissed off. Gomez. And on Facebook at Starlight Runner Entertainment.
Remember, if you want to subscribe, then join us at digitaljamsessions.com or check us out on iTunes. Thanks again for listening. digitaljamsessions.com